What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review for Greedfall 2: The Dying World, prequel to the first title. However, you'll probably notice pretty much immediately that this is not my normal review after 100%, and that's for a variety of different reasons. But first, technically speaking, I did not receive a review key for this game, but I did get a bit of an early look at it. So this game entered early access originally, and when it entered early access, I paid for the game. However, before its official release on March 12th, the game's publisher, Nacon, gave me an early access to the 1.0 build, so I did have a slight bit of a head start, but as we are well past that date at this point, this going up more than likely on like the 19th or the 20th, probably doesn't matter that much. But let's talk a little bit about why this isn't a 100% review. And honestly, there's several reasons, but the two most pressing: one, I am like 95% sure one of the achievements might be bugged, and that is a Lover of Love achievement, which is for romancing all the companions in a single playthrough, and yet, try as I might, one of the companions, Nacon actually, I can't seem to get his romance to trigger, and I'm not sure what exactly I'm messing up. And given that nobody else seems to have this achievement either, I'm guessing it might be bugged. Two, there is another achievement called Collector for finding a bunch of collectible busts, and I simply haven't found all of those. I did email Nacon in particular, talking about a few things that I was trying to wrap up before putting out this review, and they helped me with a couple of them and mentioned that they were going to get me a list of where all the busts were, but then they never followed up after that, and it's been quite a few days. Which brings me to my other point, which is that, as I'm sure many people are already aware, publisher Nacon filed for insolvency not all that long ago before the release of this game. And that situation doesn't leave a lot of hope for, I would say, continued support, especially since in places like the Steam forums, what they're doing is referring people to Nacon support in order to report things like bugs, etc. And while that has been the case since the game released into early access, to be clear, that's not like a new thing or a change. They have always been telling people that is where you need to report bugs to. The current situation makes that look, not great. And simply put, this game needs some post-launch support that I simply don't think it is going to get, or isn't going to get as much of as it probably really needs. And so for all of those reasons, kind of combining this with the technical section here in just a second, I decided to just go ahead and finish up what I was doing on this and call it a day. Because even outside of all of those issues, having played through the entire game, because it is something you can complete at least, the game has crashed on me a couple of times. I think it has some serious problems with balancing. There are some bugs with companions we'll get into, like one of them doesn't seem to have any quests, and I'm not sure if it's not supposed to have any, or if that's, like some other problem, I don't know. There's been a handful of minor issues I've run into, and while I've been able to get through most of those things, people have reported over on Steam via user reviews even more serious issues, like a problem with not being able to save the game in some cases, problems with companions getting stuck, things like that. And so, ignoring entirely everything else going on with publisher Nacon, what I would probably do is give this game a buy on sale just under normal circumstances. Add on top of the issues then with the publisher Nacon, and you have a situation where it's just like not really, I think, feasible to recommend a game like this without, buying it on an extreme sale or just waiting entirely to see what happens there, whether or not it gets post-launch support, etc., etc. And that's before you even start talking about the changes they made from the first game, which were always controversial, like the changes to combat and everything. So all told, there's just a lot of really odd situations around this game, and we're going to get into the rest of it right now, but just be aware of all of that stuff before you even think about purchasing this game right now. From there, given that we've already covered the technical section and everything, however, we may as well jump into difficulty. Now, difficulty can be kind of divided into two parts, and it is the game's profile as well as the actual game difficulty. The game profile is how you are going to control the game's tactical combat system. It's very similar to something like Dragon Age Origins if you've played that, and you have a choice between tactical, hybrid, or focused, which basically controls how much of the tactical system you need to be in charge of. You can change this whenever. It is not something that is a set-in-stone decision, but this is in combination with the actual difficulty. But, truth be told, the actual difficulty doesn't change that much either. You've basically got easy, normal, or hard, and what that for the most part does is put about a 10% difference between the party damage and enemy damage. On the higher difficulty, Tactical, the main thing you have to watch out for is friendly fire, which will be enabled, but if you build a party that isn't using AoEs and the like, it's really not that big of a deal anyway. But if you don't want to deal with any of this, the game also has an invincibility mode built in that you can just turn on. So there is that, of course. Now from there, you're going to jump into character creation. Character creation is, as with a lot of games, divided up into the cosmetic portion and then the more mechanical side of it. The cosmetic side, honestly, other than the beard thing, a pretty big improvement for spiders compared to their previous work. A lot of different options, sliders, you can mess around with it a good bit. But after that, you're going to pick skills. You can pick a sort of starting profile for your class, or you can customize it as well. What this is going to do is give you access to 2 of the total skill trees you have available. There's a bunch of them at the start of the game, and there's actually several more you can learn from companions later. So understand this is a starting point that can be undone, and when you get memory stones, which allow you to reset all this stuff, you can completely change it later. Then there are your attributes. Attributes, for the most part, coincide with a particular type of weapon you would be using, or things like health for endurance and whatnot, and then usually some secondary effects on top of that. But for the most part, you want to pump the stat you are going to be using for damage, and then something like focus, which is going to give you more action points to use in combat. However, once that is all knocked out, we can then move on to the story itself. Now, story of Greedfall 2 is one that I think actually starts off really strong and then unfortunately kind of peters out towards the end, and what's more, also does that thing that prequels tend to do, which is probably go a little too big in a way that then becomes kind of strange that the first game didn't at least talk about more. However, obligatory warning here, if you don't want spoilers of any kind, maybe go ahead and skip past this part if you hadn't already, because while I will not be going out of my way to directly spoil anything, there's some stuff here that you may consider a spoiler, I guess, and from here we're actually going to get into that. Starting with the thing I just mentioned, the story of this game kind of ends in a really big way that is, pretty important to the setting and the context of the natives of Tier 4D, which will have been introduced to in the first title, as well as the situation on the continent that all of the factions and stuff are coming in from. And it does kind of, at least for me, put me in a situation where I feel like this should have been a bigger topic of discussion in the first game, like a past event that, would have been on everybody's minds, as it's not that far in the past, like a couple of years. Either way, though, I said the story starts out pretty strong, so let's talk a little bit about that. You play a native of Tier 4D. You start off in your village as you and your friend Nacon are about to become a shaman, basically, or the tribe Donegad, which are the natives of Tier 4D that have a strong connection to the land there, which enables them to do all sorts of stuff that seem appropriately mystical in nature, and you'll have learned about this in the first game, obviously. Now, unlike the first game, what you're going to see is the initial colonization of Tier 4D in action and how they were exploiting the land and how this was causing problems for the natives. That is made especially clear when you are effectively attacked and ultimately kidnapped before being brought to the mainland to be experimented on, because the mainland is dealing with the Malachor plague. Another thing that is part of the first game, of course, and it is driving part of the exploration of Tier 4D. They're hoping to find new avenues for cures there, and because the islanders seem to be heavily resistant to it, outside of just exploiting their land, they're doing awful things to the people themselves. So combine that with a prison break followed by a trial at the Sea Faction's headquarters, the Knots, and you've got a pretty strong start that then right after that kind of trails off, honestly. It's kind of meandering afterwards, and I think that's probably the game's weak point. And it's a shame because the game starts off on such a strong foot and then just really does not follow through with that. Combine that with, again, the sort of framing issues compared to the first game, I think, and you have a story that I didn't hate, but I didn't really enjoy it as much as I was hoping to either, so, there's that. Moving on a bit to progression, however. Progression is, I would say, relatively straightforward, but there's some fun stuff in here as well. For the most part, you're going to level up. The max level is 50. When you level up, you're going to get things like attribute points and skill points to increase your attributes, obviously, and then unlock extra skills to use in combat, in some cases out of combat, like healing and stuff. And remember, as you start picking up companions, you can start, if you talk to them, learning the basics of other skill trees you don't have access to at the start of the game. This is how you're going to get access to some of the things like the different magic skill trees, rifles, that kind of thing. Now, every few levels levels, you will also get a talent. A talent is going to enable you to increase your skill in things like diplomacy, stealth, mechanics, alchemy, etc. And this is going to open up some options for you, both different alternative quest solutions, generally helpful things, etc. Like craftsmanship will let you more easily customize and craft different pieces for your armor to make you better equipped. I found that to be useful personally, as it made the gear part of this, where you upgrade and change different bits of gear to make them more useful and tailored to individual builds, etc., was also pretty helpful, and that kind of explains the gear portion of progression. Though I gotta say, a lot of this armor does look great, and I do wish there was like a transmog system or something, because some of this is some incredible drip. Now, I will say I do think there are some balance problems with the talents in particular. I don't think they are created equal, and sometimes they don't make a ton of sense. So take stealth, for example. They expanded stealth gameplay in this particular iteration of the Greedfall series, as in the original it wasn't super useful, as the disguise system was in place. Well, here it's been enhanced a bit. You can upgrade stealth and everything to make you more likely to evade detection. However, upgrading stealth is also how you get the ability to actually use the upgraded disguises, except you don't need the upgraded disguises. The different disguises to allow you to, navigate restricted areas without being detected as easily. The thing is, you don't need disguises if you've leveled up your stealth, because that is just easier and disguises don't matter that much. So the whole thing feels a little silly. I also noticed that while alchemy is useful for, doing alchemy and giving yourself different concoctions, brewing traps, things like that, most of the checks in which you would use alchemy are, pretty on the low side and don't really matter a ton, to be honest. And so there's just a lot of stuff like that, and overall I would say, if anything, diplomacy proved to be the most useful, simply because of how often it comes up in conversations and generally makes your life a bit easier. And then there's also some balancing issues with other things we're going to get into, but one thing at a time. So let's talk a little bit about gameplay and world from here. So a short ways after the introduction, and the introduction, to be clear, is a fair bit long, but basically as you leave Uxantis, the home of the Knots, you'll gain access through the story to a ship called the Constantia. I always want to call this thing the Constanza, but whatever. The thing is, what I was a little disappointed to realize is that after you get your ship, which does act as your home base, where you'll, talk to companions, pick up their quests, which you can only do one at a time, by the way, access all the different vendors, heal up and things if you want, you're only going to travel from the ship to 2 cities on the mainland, really, which is Perrin and Olima. These are cool cities, and each of them does have like an area outside of the city to explore, but one of the main premises of Greedfall 2 is that you were leaving the island of Tirfredi to instead explore the continent. And then it turns out that exploring the continent is basically just 2 cities and Uxantis, which isn't technically part of the continent, really. And given that they, built that up as one of the core features of this game and exploring different parts of the admittedly very interesting setting, was definitely a bummer to me personally. So there is that, I suppose. Now, on the bright side, however, there are plenty of quests and things to get up to across these different places. Oftentimes what you'll do is either pick up notes and stuff that you can find around, which are the triggers for the quests themselves, or maybe run up on a situation that you can then help to resolve in some way. And it does breathe a little bit of life into these areas, or, giving change to beggars, and then learning that if you give a bit of change to every beggar in a given area, you can get some extra bonuses and stuff, and a lot of that is pretty fun. There's some decent side quests in there, and a lot of it's going to be, of course, commented upon by your various companions that you'll bring with you. And while the cities themselves don't ever really feel quite alive, as this is ultimately a AA game, I would say, they did some overall fun stuff. Now, the part where we run into problems and everything is, like I mentioned, the restricted areas. There's the stealth versus disguise problem. And we can knock out enemies outright this time around if you get close enough to them, which is actually, in some cases, a super handy way to deal with a bunch of enemies before you actually have to fight them. I thought that was a fun mix-up of the gameplay, and it puts more of an emphasis on that system than the first game ever did. There's even a handful of puzzles that require splitting your party up and utilizing different weights and things, and while none of them are super complicated, I can see them trying to mess around with more mechanics this time around, which was enjoyable. And yet, even here we have a handful of problems. There is, just like the first game, a ton of backtracking. This is because the story is, in fact, a pretty good length, and yet you don't really have a lot of places to go to express that story. As mentioned, only 2 cities, really, Perrin and Olima, that you'll be in for the most part, and then Uxantis. And so you're going to find yourself in the same place just frequently over and over again. coming back to some area that was locked off previously that you've of course seen up to this point, and just having to run back and forth a lot. And that's not unusual for Spiders games at all, but it is a bit of game design I do wish they would move past. But from there, let's talk a little bit about the companions. There are 7 of them in total. 4 of them are romanceable. I do want to talk about the one that I think was probably the biggest case of missed opportunity, and that is actually Till. So Till is a companion that is basically responsible for you getting captured on Tier 4D. He killed someone important to you, he's like the reason you're imprisoned, and through some convoluted events, he eventually joined your party as a companion. That should be a really ripe ground for a lot of back and forth, and I don't know if it's a bug or not, but they really dropped the ball here. Each companion typically has several quests and stuff, and then you get an achievement at the end of it, and yet all they've done for Till is have a single conversation where you can just choose to forgive him, which then unlocks the achievement for the guy. I don't know if there's a bug preventing quests he is supposed to have from triggering, as all of the other ones have quests, and if that really is all that he has, I would be severely disappointed at, again, the wasted opportunity there. Now, the other companions are mostly pretty good. You start with your friend Nacon, who's going to accompany you to the mainland. He has a great quest about, rallying your people in this strange land. There is Ludwig, the smuggler, who helps you break out of prison and everything. He has some stories about his family and what they're going to be dealing with, of course. These all represent factions, as you would expect as well. There's Sybil. She is a member of the Devesp family, a sort of antagonist faction from the original game as well. She's a tremendous character, actually my favorite of the series as a whole, as she is kind of riddled with family problems and assassinations and things that get associated with the Devesp family, and I think they just did a wonderful job with her. There's Fausta, a member of the religious faction of Thélème. She has a slightly more personal journey, I would say, trying to get back into her country's good graces, if you will, while also earning some absolution in terms of her own faith. Then you have Alvida, your member of the Knots and the person who technically owns the ship you're sailing around on. Her story has some family drama. You've got the old cartographer Safia, who does, I think, a decent job of showing you that the scientists from the Bridge Alliance are not all, absolutely heartless monsters. But ultimately, the companions are a bit hit or miss. Some of them are pretty good. Some of them, I would say, are uninspired. The romances are very video gamey. You have a couple conversations, flirt with them, hit the stat at the appropriate time, accept the relationship. There's a steamy romance scene, and that's pretty much it. What you would expect in this kind of game, I would imagine. But all of that does finally bring us to combat. Combat is interesting in the sense that it's the biggest change from the original game and therefore by far the most controversial overall. In particular, we changed from a more third-person action type system to a more tactical top-down system where you control parties more tactically, or at least hopefully more tactically, I guess. And while this change has always been hit or miss for people, a lot of people just wish they had improved upon the original third-person system in the first game. Having played that first game relatively recently to get ready for this, I can see why they chose to just change it outright, as to be honest with you, I don't think the first game system was that great or necessarily worth the improvements they would need to do. But, change isn't going to be for everybody. They had one genre, they've effectively kind of changed it for this game, and that's going to upset some people just by default. However, the basic system is decent enough, and I think it's engaging enough, but does run into some balancing problems itself. Though do remember you can turn on invincibility mode at any point. But the gist of it is you're going to perform basic attacks with whatever weapon you've chosen for that character. This is going to build action points, which you will then utilize to perform your skills from the skill trees you have invested in. One of the main mechanics to know are your shields as well as your magical deflection. So you will have shielding. Shielding will reduce incoming physical damage by a certain amount based on how many shields you have, given from your armor and everything. Certain skills and whatnot will break through these shields, reducing that damage reduction. However, these shields can be backed up by magical deflection. Magical deflection will prevent damage, but won't stop shields from getting broken, and you'll have to eat through that before you can get to a target's health. Magic attacks, however, will typically cut through those shields and ignore them entirely, but then, all sorts of different skills from different weapon types will affect these differently. There's buffs, debuffs for you and the enemy. Obviously, crowd control goes a long way, and the tactical situation of trying to make sure you are doing things like utilizing choke points points, maybe using stealth to take out enemies before they even see you and before you engage fully in combat. That's certainly a possibility. I did that quite a bit. And putting that all together, it's a system that feels pretty good, but does have a significant balancing issue that is common enough in games, and I think they may be relying on invincibility or something like that to overcome it. But basically what tends to happen is the game starts off decently challenging. You might have some issues getting to grips with it, but once you get through the relatively linear opening, so to speak, of the Island of Tier 4D, the imprisonment, the breakout, Uxantis, once you get out of that section, you're free to sort of chase down leads a little more non-linearly. This leads to a situation where you then quickly overcome the challenge of combat because you are, going to have to go to each of those places, or at least have the potential to go to each of those places in any order thanks to the non-linear part of it. That means after the initially fairly challenging opening, depending on the difficulty you're playing on, once you reach that point, you suddenly overcome the challenge and become much stronger than the enemies you are facing because of your progress and the fact that the game has to be ready for you to have done it in a different order. And that will basically continue until you suddenly get to the end of the game, where the game suddenly realizes that you have to be at a certain power level by now if you've done everything, and there's a massive difficulty spike right at the end of the game. A difficulty spike that is somewhat induced by just sheer numbers in some cases, I would say. And that can be a little bit annoying. Add on top of that the fact that this tactical system does not have something like a proper AI setup system like tactics from Dragon Age Origins, the Gambit system from Final Fantasy XII, or the similar system from Pillars of Eternity 2. And you kind of just have to rely on generic AI for your party members via the autonomous party command, which you can toggle on and off. But it's an area where I really do feel like they could have improved this, especially given the games they were trying to emulate. So then you add on top of that the situation around the change in combat, and you've got a situation where the combat is mostly okay, but it's, I'd say lacking in a few specific areas. And then with the change, some people aren't going to be happy with this for sure. I'm not fully satisfied with it myself, but it's better than it was in the early access period. I do appreciate how much it improved from there in particular, but it's not perfect for sure. Which brings us to the Steam Deck section. The Steam Deck is short and sweet. It is straight up not supported. The one-pager they sent over when they initially gave me the early look at the 1.0 build, it mentioned that the game isn't going to work on the Steam Deck. It shouldn't be starting up even, and I downloaded it and tried myself. Sure enough, the game would not run. Though I will point out that seems to be a problem with the release build. There was versions of the early access that was working with the Steam Deck, but for whatever reason, the launch build has essentially a guaranteed crash right towards the beginning of the game that makes it more or less impossible. I simply put would not expect to play this on that platform, just as a heads up. But that does bring us to our positives and negatives before we wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, the biggest one by far for me remains the setting and world here. The setting and the world and the fantasy of the world of Greedfall is really interesting. It's the main thing that keeps me interested in playing a game like this for this prequel. I also enjoyed a lot of the places where they clearly tried to improve upon gameplay, the expanded stealth and disguise system. Even if it is still a little bit wonky, they clearly put in some effort there. They expanded the talents in general beyond even those things to, try to do different things with them. I appreciate the changes and things they made to combat, and while I don't think that system's perfect by any means, but I would also say there's a lot of problems, specifically with the balancing across a lot of different things, really. There's the issues with like stealth and disguises, which I think are kind of annoying. There's some combat balancing problems across different portions of the game. There's the fact that this game is, trying to push big into getting to explore the continent this time around, and I feel like they didn't quite deliver on that. There are the problems with, the companion Till seemingly not having any substantial content. I'm not sure if that's a bug or not or what, but it's a problem. And all of that kind of brings me to my conclusion. Ignoring entirely the situation with their publisher Nacon, I would probably give this a buy on sale because it has just a few too many issues, especially with the technical state. I had a few problems, other people are having even bigger problems, the balancing issues, etc. Under normal circumstances, I would probably have given this a buy on sale. Add on top of that situation, then, the situation with Nacon, the publisher, being insolvent, and while that's not like a guaranteed going out of business thing, it, obviously makes people hesitant to buy the thing, because we don't know what post-launch support looks like. It's been a week since this launched in full. We haven't heard anything. I doubt they're even allowed to talk about it, just, from general experience with those kinds of things. And all of that puts you into a situation where While I do think this game has some merits, I'd be hard-pressed to give it any sort of recommendation or, outside of just buying it on a cheap sale if you happen to see one, while at the same time understanding exactly what you're getting. More than anything, I would just be really, really cautious with this title, and that is genuinely a bummer to me. I really like what Spiders does as a studio. Their game, The Technomancer, being one of my favorites from them specifically, actually. And so while I hope Spiders makes it out of this okay, I genuinely would hate to see them close. I also have to do my job, and at the end of the day, I cannot in good faith recommend this, which is, unfortunately, where I have to leave off this review. So hopefully you got something out of that. If you did, by all means, feel free to let me know how you feel about all of it down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.